We're proud to support the craft of journalism. UBS brings you the latest news from around the world with The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Be part of an international network that brings together leading insights, research, and technology across 24 time zones and 12 key financial hubs, with you at the center of it all. UBS. Advice is our craft.
You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 15th of August 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up, Putin hails Trump's energetic and sincere efforts to end the war in Ukraine. Is this genuine admiration before their meeting in Alaska, or damnation with faint praise? We'll look ahead to a summit intended to decide the fate of Ukraine without the country's president in the room. Also ahead, we'll turn our attention to Alaska as it steps up as host.
Alaska's champions point to the state's strategic geopolitical location. It's the territory that makes the U.S. an Arctic nation, and in their view, the perfect bridge between Washington and Moscow.
Also ahead in the next 60 minutes, Bolivia's left-wing government looks on the verge of collapse as voters prepare for this weekend's elections. We'll look at Friday's newspapers and...
It was really the classic American story in the sense that you have this founder who came from nothing, built this business, is now handing it down to his sons, and in the 40 years that elapsed in between has gone through all manner of chaos.
We'll pull back the curtain on one of America's most famous strip clubs. That's all coming up on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in today's news. The governor of California, Gavin Newsom, says he plans to redraw the map of the state to counterbalance the same move being done by Republicans in Texas. There's been fierce international criticism of Israel's decision to start work on contentious new settlements in the occupied West Bank. And the remote Pacific nation of the Marshall Islands has made sporting history by playing its first international football match. They faced the US Virgin Islands, who beat them 4-0. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. But first, Alaska is enjoying a major boost in population today, as it seems that half of the world's media is heading there to temporarily join the 740,000 existing residents. The press are there to try to report on a meeting that only involves two men, Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, plus their translators. The number in the room is small, but the stakes are high, from the future of Ukraine to the future of Europe. Or are they? And what does Moscow actually want out of this? Well, in a moment, I'll be joined by the author and Russia analyst Stephen DL. But first, Monocle's Seattle correspondent Greg Scruggs explains the soft power of the summit's location of Alaska.
And I think the president of the United States getting in the room with the president of Russia, sitting face to face rather than speaking over the telephone, will give this president the best indication of how to end this war and where this is headed.
The run-up to today's tete-a-tete in Alaska between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin begged one question: where? Beyond the usual secrecy entailed by the comings and goings of heads of state, there simply wasn't an obvious venue for a meeting of this magnitude. Once Alaska was determined as the host, the general coordinates were preordained because only the runways in Anchorage can accommodate both Air Force One and the Russian presidential plane. But State Department and Russian Foreign Ministry envoys struggled to pin down a suitable locale before finally announcing Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson on Wednesday. That's because, to put it mildly, Anchorage is a dump. The state's largest city was leveled in a magnitude 9.2 earthquake in 1964. It was rebuilt quickly and without much aesthetic grace. For starters, there's only one marquee lodging property, the Hotel Captain Cook. The interior boasts some suitable nooks for hushed diplomatic chats, and there are local touches that convey a sense of place. I recommend the reindeer sausage for breakfast. But the property consists of a pair of largely uninspiring towers erected in the 1960s and 70s. Now, Putin isn't the first head of state to have been given the Alaskan hangar treatment. Richard Nixon welcomed Emperor Hirohito to Elmendorf Air Base in 1971. A decade later, Pope John Paul II received marginally better hospitality when Ronald Reagan met him inside the Fairbanks Airport in 1984. So in that vein, Trump and Putin could have commandeered the recently renovated Alaska Airlines lounge at Ted Stevens International Airport for a quick in and out. But such a makeshift solution would only further undercut the state's diplomatic aspirations. Indeed, much of the world has puzzled over the choice of Alaska in lieu of rising stars like Istanbul, Doha, and Riyadh. Putin had reportedly suggested the UAE for today's summit, and Viktor Orban's Budapest was a close second. Alaska's champions point to the state's strategic geopolitical location. It's the territory that makes the U.S. an Arctic nation, and in their view, the perfect bridge between Washington and Moscow. But its built environment needs some sprucing up. Ultimately, Alaskan civic leaders need to build on these architectural legacies to make good on their conviction that a midpoint between North America and Eurasia could serve as the fulcrum for negotiations in the new great power era. That both Russian and Chinese officials can travel there without crossing into foreign airspace is both practical and symbolic, given concerns about international criminal court jurisdiction and the desire, rightly or wrongly, to exclude European participation. Plus, there's a powerful bilateral symbolism today. Moscow sold the territory in 1867 to Washington. To this day, the U.S. National Park Service maintains multiple Russian Orthodox religious buildings in Alaska as historic sites. Despite Alaska's shared cultural heritage between the two nations, Trump and Putin were unlikely to meet in a restored sod roof blockhouse, first built by the Russian-American company in 1841 as a fur trading outpost, whatever its period charms. What world leaders need is a setting where inspiring design fosters healthy dialogue. In 1986, Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev sat down in Reykjavik at Hofoi, an intimate early 20th century house, and began thawing the Cold War. 2 years ago, Joe Biden and Xi Jinping strolled a bucolic country estate outside San Francisco, signaling a ratcheting down of Sino-American tensions. Where is the cool yet cozy enclave blending the best of Pacific Northwest modernism and contemporary Arctic design sensibilities? Something that could elevate Anchorage to Geneva on the Inlet for fireside chats. Alaska, as of yet, falls short.
Monocle's Gregory Scruggs there. Well, to tell us what's actually going to be happening inside these room, or that room, I'm joined now by the Russia analyst and author Stephen Diel. A very good morning to you, Stephen. Welcome back.
Good morning, Emma.
So let's talk about, despite the setting and what it appears to be quite inauspicious lodgings, this is a moment that, are we expecting great things to come from this meeting?
In a word, no. I was slightly nervous when you said someone who's going to tell us what's going to happen, and that's supposed to be me. I don't have a crystal ball or a magic wand, I'm afraid. It's yes, the setting is one thing, and that's been very well covered just now. But what worries me most, as someone who has followed Russia for many years and followed the war very closely and is very concerned about Ukraine's fate in this, is Trump's ability to listen to the last person who spoke in his ear, and also it seems to be seduced by Putin, because the fact it's taking place at all, I think, is a surprise, and it's taken place at very short notice. Normally these high-level meetings, the highest level, two presidents, these are prepared over months, and there's back and forth between the underlings, the various civil servants and so on who's setting it all up. And this has happened effectively at a week's notice. And Trump shoots from the hip. He says one thing one day, he says another thing the next day. And Putin is much more cunning than Trump. Putin is very good at taking advantage of a situation and persuading his listener to believe what he says. Look at the way the Russian nation, in many cases, have rallied behind him with the war. So I think the real worry is that Trump will be thinking, well, this is great. I've got this meeting set up, and my old mate Putin I'm talking to him, and that he could come out of this meeting saying that he's prepared to give some concessions to Putin, which Ukraine certainly is not prepared, such as territory.
And that's the thing, isn't it? Because Ukraine isn't in the room. If Donald Trump agrees to one of Vladimir Putin's demands, that could fundamentally change the lives of many, many Ukrainians and indeed Europeans.
Absolutely, it could. Yes, the demands that Putin has have never changed. Putin ideally wants to take the whole of Ukraine back into a new kind of Russian empire. But for now, because the war didn't go as he intended when he invaded in February 2022, when he thought he'd be in Kiev in 3 days, he's for now settled on taking these four borders, Donetsk, Luhansk, border territory, or close to the border territories, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. He doesn't control, Russian troops don't control all of any of those territories. So he wants Ukrainians to pull out of what is their territory so that he can have those. He wants Ukraine to disarm. He wants Ukraine never to join NATO. And as the Ukrainians rightly say, this just sets them up for Putin to rearm. Because the Russian army is in a pretty poor state now. They've had to use a lot of equipment, a lot of weaponry that has been in storage for many years. So they need to build up their forces again. But once they do, say in 5 years, because they're building a lot of tanks, a lot of equipment quickly at the moment, then he's got a bridgehead, particularly in Donetsk, to attack Ukraine again. And if Ukraine is not allowed to make alliances with Western countries, they're not allowed to join NATO, there's no security guarantee. And the fear is that Trump may be so, and I use the word again, deliberately seduced by Putin, that he'll say, well, the man's fair, this is okay, this is what we should do. And it certainly isn't. And this is what the Europeans, and of course Ukraine itself in the person of Zelensky, have been trying to get across to Trump this week, particularly in that call they had on Wednesday.
Trump says there's a 25% chance of failure. What happens if this goes wrong?
To be honest, if this goes wrong, I don't think it changes the situation a great deal. Except that if Trump has said, he might pull out and say, well, no more. In which case, if Trump then decides he's not going to help Ukraine at all, then that's very bad news for Ukraine. But if Trump does actually see through Putin for once and sees that what Putin is demanding is illegal in international law, he's wanting boundaries changed because of force. If he actually sees that Putin's demands are unacceptable and unfair, then he may go down the path of actually supporting Ukraine more and sending more weaponry to Ukraine. He had an about turn rather like this. It didn't come to a meeting between the two, but there was a situation similar to this in his first presidency, and Ukraine did get more weaponry. So if it goes that way, then unfortunately, sadly, it means the war continues, but it means that Ukraine has the weaponry it needs. If he doesn't, if Putin bends his ear to the extent that he feels that, well, Ukraine's got to give up some territory, that Trump feels Ukraine's got to give up some territory, then that's very worrying. So that would be the worst outcome possible. If there's a neutral outcome and Putin and Trump agree to meet again sometime, then that hopefully wouldn't ruin Ukraine's chances of still getting weaponry and support from America.
Stephen Dalziel, Russia analyst, thank you so much for joining us on the line. You're listening to The Globalist. 2:13 a.m. in La Paz, 7:13 a.m. here in London. Now, Bolivians go to the polls this weekend at a moment when the country's economy is buckling and its government also appears to be on its knees. Inflation is soaring while fuel supplies are low. But is there indeed a candidate who can fix the mess? Or will anyone apart from the current administration do? Well, to tell us more, I'm joined by Chris Sabatini, Senior Fellow for Latin America at Chatham House here in London. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning.
So just explain to us, I've outlined very briefly the situation in Bolivia, but how bad is it?
It's serious. You mentioned the fuel shortages, which is curious because Bolivia is sitting on a large reserve of natural gas. That was mismanaged shortly after former President Evo Morales of the governing party currently, but no longer in office, was elected in 2005. He nationalized Bolivia's gas fields and gas company, and it led to underinvestment, underproduction, and the decline. And as a result of that, also the general economy declined, as did the state of the state's public fiscal budget. So what we've seen is a decline is around 1% the last 2 years, dropping down from 3%. Inflation is climbing, as you mentioned, and there's simply a real lack of work and really much hope. But they're really taking it out right now. Voters on the MAS party, which is governed with the exception of between 2019 and 2020, when Evo Morales attempted to steal an election, and there's an interim president. They've governed for 20 years now. So there's a very high anti-incumbent attitude, to the extent that which 94% of voters say things are bad or very bad. So clearly, the governing party isn't going to win. The question is, of the field of 9 candidates, who will even make it to the second round? And this looks like it's going to head to a second round, which will be held in October.
Indeed. What you mentioned there reflects something that I read yesterday, that there was one voter who just went, I don't care who it is who comes into power, as long as it's not the MAS party. And to be in that state of affairs, and what does that say about Bolivia's ability to fix itself?
Well, first of all, it's even worse than that. 25% of voters are still undecided, and 45% say they could still change their vote. And this poll was conducted in late July. So there's clearly just a sense of just being completely fed up. I do think Bolivia has some advantages. First of all, it's connected to Brazil and Argentina, which are and could be greater consumers of its natural gas. It needs to attract investment. To do that, first of all, it has to reprivatize the national gas company. It also needs to reprivatize its lithium holdings. It has some of the greatest lithium reserves of the world, but it dragged its feet because those are controlled by the state. It dragged its feet in opening up those lithium flats, which are in the highlands, to investment. And then they basically conceded all of them to China, which has taken its time, actually, if you will, in exploiting that. So there are potential reserves that are open. It simply is a matter of putting in much more market-friendly policies and opening up Bolivia to global trade.
And who is going to do this in terms of which political direction is any victor going to come from, given the fact that we've had the MAS party, which is left-wing, in power for a very, very long time. Evo Morales, who was the charismatic figure that dominated Bolivian politics for a very, very long time, but was ousted because he couldn't stand again, and is now being seen as the man who made all these problems come about for Bolivia. What would Bolivia be like if it stopped being left-wing and turned towards the right-wing populism, which seems to be getting quite a lot of traction?
It's a good question because, in 2005 and really for the decade after that and even more, Bolivia seemed like a very solidly left-wing country in terms of its majority voting population. Evo Morales was very popular, as you mentioned. Now, all of basically the top 4 candidates are varying degrees of right-wing or conservative. The leading candidate, the man who could probably win, is Samuel Doria Medina, who is basically is a former businessman. He is seen as a can-do man. He does have experience in government, having served as planning minister. I think he would pursue a much more market-friendly approach. The second, who is a former MAS politician, Andrónico Rodriguez, who's running third in the polls, he's now skewing also center-right. So I think it looks like whoever makes it to the second round, which will be in October, as I mentioned, is probably going to be a conservative candidate. And quite frankly, I think that the population, something I would have never predicted, say 10 years ago, I think the population is expecting a little bit of pain, some market reforms, and some injection of price stability, and even reduction in very generous public subsidies to try to right the economy. So I think it's not going to be as polarized a country coming out of the MAS years as many people fear.
Chris Sabatini, Senior Fellow for Latin America at Chatham House, thank you so much for joining us on The Globalist. Still to come on today's programme.
We learned that nobody was more determined to come down hard on scofflaws beleaguering the nation's capital than the felon in question, or indeed in chief.
That's Andrew Muller, and he'll bring us what we learned a little later.
Craft is its own reward, which is why at UBS, we're honoured to work alongside over 50 of today's leading Nobel laureates, Each an expert in the art of economic science, bringing you engaging discussions, actionable insights, and inspired solutions, all focused around the questions that shape our world today. For a better outlook, find a Nobel perspective. UBS. Banking is our craft.
Let's continue now with today's newspapers. Joining me in the studio, Nina Dos Santos, international broadcast correspondent, former CNN Europe editor and friend of the programme. Good morning, Nina. How's life with you? You look marvellous. You look as if you're going to go for another run. Is that correct?
You know me. It's a Friday. I love coming to Monocle Radio studios because then I get to do Hyde Park and Kensington Gardens before 10.
And when London is working at the moment, I don't know about you, but have you noticed that actually, dare I say it, because everyone's on holiday, it's gone a bit Parisian insofar as with the Londoners gone, London, loads of tourists, let's be frank, but is actually a joy to be in.
Yeah, I've always loved London when it's empty in August because not only do you get sort of dawn rising very, very early, so you get, those quiet moments at about 5 a.m. if you want to go for a run or come into Monocle Radio studios, but it's lighter than at other times of the year. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. But speaking of tourists, we've had a lot of US tourists and we've had a very important visitor in these here shores in the form of J.D. Vance, who's been rankling some locals, not in London, but up in the Cotswolds, which appears to be the latest sort of holiday destination of choice for rich and powerful Americans.
Indeed, it's been an absolute joy watching local press trying to cover the convoy and the places that he's been to, and obviously he went to visit the US troops. But there's nothing better than a massive, massive international figure rocking up at a tiny village in England. It's always good fun.
That's right. Well, J.D. Vance is still on his busman's holiday, shall we call it? A glamorous version thereof. And the jamboree continues at the moment because he's actually in Ayrshire in Scotland until Sunday, but he spent much of the last week in the Cotswolds, that genteel chocolate box set of villages deep in the English Oxfordshire countryside, home to a lot of rich and famous people, including former prime ministers like David Cameron. Lots of movie stars have moved there from the United States. Also the Beckhams, have a big footprint there, the footballer and pop star. Well, residents of a particular village called the hamlet of Dean, right next to Chipping Norton, have said that
these are real names, aren't they, ladies and gentlemen?
Oh yeah, we could go through the whole lot of them. Actually, to be quite honest with you, I haven't spent a huge amount of time in the Cotswolds. I know it a little bit. But it has become extremely glamorous, it has to say, and a sort of rich footprint over the last 20 or so years. And that continues apace with J.D. Vance putting it back on the map for Americans. So residents in this tiny little hamlet say that in preparation for the Vice President's visit, when he was staying in a manor house in this particular hamlet, local British police had been instructed, they claimed, to knock on their doors and ask for their social media handles. Why was this? Those residents said, well, apparently it was because they were told the United States wanted to vet their social media output to see whether it was safe for the Vice President to actually, take to the streets nearby this village. Obviously, they were extremely aggrieved. Thames Valley Police, the local police force, denies this. They say that, perhaps some officers might have inquired, but these residents were under no obligation to give over any details. But the reality is this throws up two things. One, heightened tensions about really contentious geopolitical issues that have followed J.D. Vance on his trip to the UK, in particular protests over the United States' stance on Gaza and the war with Israel on Gaza. And also this rather ridiculous situation we have with the United States and J.D. Vance using this visit to take aim at freedom of speech laws in the United Kingdom, when it seems as though people in this local village felt that their freedom of speech was actually impinged by the US Vice President's visit in the first place.
It's absolutely wonderful how withering the comments have been about J.D. Vance. And he's obviously trying to have a holiday. Bless him, but
quite a high-profile one.
Quite a high-profile one. And what I rather love is the way that the British can sort of they're very good at pricking the balloon with a pin. So there have been protests, and one of them is J.D. Vance claps when the plane lands, and the other one is J.D. Vance's Netflix password is password. The delightful thing about this, which is what's being covered in The Independent, is it's not a serious critique of US foreign policy, but it is just belittling J.D. Vance himself.
Well, and let's remember that this isn't unique to the United Kingdom, because he went skiing in Vermont not that long ago and protests followed him there. And I remember some of the signs were something like J.D. Vance skis in jeans, which was a reference to the fact that, you know, he has hillbilly roots on the Appalachian Mountains. That's how he came onto the scene, by claiming that he was somebody who managed to navigate terrible poverty in his childhood to make it all the way to Yale and then make it to Silicon Valley, venture capital world, make his money and get a political footprint. And here he is as vice president, potentially the person who takes over from Donald Trump in a few years' time. So it's not just the UK where he's faced protests when he's gone on holiday because he's such a polarising figure. But it's interesting because he patched into that big pre-call with EU leaders just the other day from one of these villages. So he is actually still navigating really important foreign policy decisions during this family holiday in the UK, and people are taking to the streets to protest about that, even in these tiny little villages.
What's the next story you brought in, Nina?
So the next one I was looking at was, which I thought was interesting, one that's covered by the Times of London, speaks to the over-tourism phenomenon that Venice is facing. I mean, this isn't new. You've covered on this on this show many times. I myself spent about a year living near Venice during my university years, and I've got to say it's changed in the 20 years since then. It now only has 50,000 inhabitants in the historic centre of the city, and it's really struggling coping with 30 million tourists a year. And that, again, has just pitted locals against all these Instagram influencers. And what they've noticed, the latest cohort of influencers who want to grab a selfie on a gondola, is that actually you can get round paying the €80 plus to rent your own gondola if you take one of these traghetti. That's a sort of big gondola, which is like the gondola carpool for local Venetians to cross the Grand Canal. And it gives you the opportunity to take one of those, frankly, silly little selfies at the end of a boat, pretending that you're on a gondola. And this means that there have been very significant queues. It's overburdened the system. And again, Venetian local officials are really having a hard time, struggling with meeting the needs to welcome these tourists, whilst also meeting the needs of locals who are just dwindling in the numbers, abandoning the city. It's a city that is sinking under the weight of environmental change and also under the weight of over-tourism and cultural differences that don't necessarily protect Venetian ways of life.
OK, next story that you've got for us today, Nina?
Well, let's have a look at the next one. The next one was very interesting because it's about HSBC. This is Europe's biggest bank by assets. It's got about 210,000 staff globally, 31,000 of whom are in the UK. So obviously it's got a huge footprint in the UK from its legacy as, when it was created, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. Gasp! One would have heard when the Strategic Communications Department, one assumes of this enormous bank, realised that somebody had leaked to Reuters their security plans for their new building in the City of London, which is half the size of the footprint of the enormous skyscraper that they have in Canary Wharf. But even though it's half the size, it's going to have a fourfold increase in camera surveillance and biometric surveillance or biometric data use of its staff. So it currently has 444 cameras. That's going to be increased to 1,754 cameras surveilling staff, apparently. And also they're going to be using biometric data increasingly to try and access the higher echelons of the building, so for top management staff. I suppose this speaks to two things. One, it's a reflection of new technology, AI, etc., and also it's a reflection of the fact that the banking industry is extremely heavily regulated, but it's having to cope with hybrid working patterns since COVID allowed a lot of people to work from home. So they feel that from a regulatory point of view, remember that HSBC suffered rather significant fines over the last decade or so for things such as allegations by the United States of, not doing KYC on their clients and stuff. As a result, they probably feel that they need to increase security, but it does seem quite draconian, doesn't it? 1,754 cameras and also the use of biometric data.
Nina Dos Santos, international broadcast correspondent and former CNN Europe editor. Thank you so much for joining me in the studio. You're listening to The Globalist. Now, a quick look at some of the other stories we're following today. The governor of California, Gavin Newsom, says he plans to redraw the map of the state to counterbalance the same move being done by Republicans in Texas. Mr. Newsom called on Democrats to fight fire with fire in an attempt to offset plans in Texas that would help to secure a Republican majority in the House. There's been fierce international criticism of Israel's decision to start work on contentious new settlements in the occupied West Bank. Britain's Foreign Secretary David Lammy has said the plans to build more than 3,000 new homes breached international law. Japan has marked the 80th anniversary of its defeat in the Second World War, with Prime Minister Ishiba attending a war memorial event in Tokyo along with Emperor Naruhito. But the anniversary was marked by controversy as the country's agriculture minister went to the Yasukuni Shrine, which Japan's neighbours view as a symbol of wartime aggression. And the remote Pacific nation of the Marshall Islands has made sporting history by playing its first international football match on a high school pitch in Arkansas. With a population of less than 40,000 and no full-sized football pitches, several players had never even played an 11-a-side football match before. They face the US Virgin Islands, who beat them 4-0. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. It's what 8:31 in Belgrade, 7:31 here in London. Let's hear an update from the Balkans by Guy Delorney, our Balkans correspondent, joining me on the line from Ljubljana. Good morning, Guy. How's Ljubljana looking this morning?
Good morning, Emma. Ljubljana's looking lovely. At this time of the morning, it's nice and cool and sunny, but of course later on it gets very oveny indeed. We've had temperatures up in the mid-30s this week, so definitely get out early and then stay in for the rest of the day.
And then just close the curtains and hide under a table.
Absolutely. I'm down in the basement for half the day, honestly.
Wonderful. Well, that's where we'll find that. That sounds so sinister. What's in your basement?
Well, I'm speaking to you from the basement at the moment, so one of my studio setups, I have the sort of hot weather studio set up down here so I can retreat from upstairs because we don't have air conditioning. We try and passively cool the house, but it only goes so far. And there's a selection of guitars you'll be thrilled to know as well. So if anybody wants to stop by for a jam, please do.
My goodness, what a hideaway. Thank you, Guy. Let's talk about what's happening where you are in your part of the world. Hugely violent protests in Serbia, unexpectedly violent.
Yes, I mean, I think if we say hugely violent, it's the violence that's striking rather than the number of participants. Because as I was talking on the briefing earlier this week, the protests have morphed into a small-scale affair for the summer, if you like. And people who've been following these protests will know that they've been going on in Serbia since last November, when we had this disaster at Novi Sad railway station. And so the protests, in essence, were anti-corruption protests wanting to know why this disaster had happened. They've morphed really into anti-government protests. But when you get to the summer in Serbia, frankly, everybody goes to the beach. I was in Croatia earlier this week trying to do some interviews with various different people, and honestly, 4 out of 5 people that I contacted would say, I'm at the beach right now. So people do tend to disappear. And that's why we were expecting the summer not to be a long, hot one, politically speaking, in Serbia, but to be somewhat more small scale. We'd have these small protests in neighbourhoods, organised by citizens' assemblies. But those have turned violent this week. And again, just last night, we once again saw on the streets, not just of Belgrade, but other cities, including Novi Sad, Pančevo, Niš, you're seeing the police, protesters and supporters of the governing Progressive Party all having a go at each other. And we're just, looking at the numbers. I think if it's a Dacic, who's the Interior Minister of Serbia, said 42 police were injured at the rallies last night, 26 of them in Belgrade, and 37 people were arrested. So it's heated up, and it's heated up unexpectedly. Let's
move on to a story from Bosnia. What's going on here?
Well, in Bosnia, people who follow stories in Bosnia will hear the name Milorad Dodik rather a lot. He's the Bosnian Serb leader. His official title is President of Republika Srpska. Republika Srpska is one of the two regions into which Bosnia and Herzegovina is divided. And basically, he has an awful lot of power. But he's been sentenced by a court to 1 year in prison, and he's been banned from public office for 6 years because he didn't enact the orders of the International High Representative, who's the ultimate power in Bosnia. And Mr. Dodik has been engaged in a bit of a to and fro with the High Representative, and so far it looks like the High Representative is winning. So now Mr. Dodik is facing this ban from public office. He's bought himself out of that 1 year prison sentence. So in essence, he's recognised the court's verdict. He's appealing against the 6 year ban from public office. But what he says he's going to do is hold a referendum. And this referendum, he says, will be on Milorad Dodik. He's going to ask the people of Republika Srpska whether they want him or not, in essence. It's a completely unconstitutional move, of course, and we're just going to end up with more grief between Mr. Dodik and the authorities.
Indeed, because you generally assume that elections do that job. Is he expecting a big yes?
Well, this is the thing. I don't think Milorad Dodik is particularly liked in Republika Srpska. That's the thing. He does get elected, but the elections are an odd thing in Republika Srpska. You've got the usual things with, the capture of public institutions and people relying on particular parties for their jobs. And people who in Republika Srpska are mostly Bosnian Serbs, they don't like the feeling that Bosnian Serbs are under attack by the central institutions of Bosnia or anybody else for that matter. So there's that sort of feeling that comes into play. But Milorad Dodik, no, he's not a particularly loved figure at all. People can see that he's very good at profiting out of his position, and if he's removed, somebody else will just go into his place. So he might be a bit shocked and stunned if he does go to a referendum.
Finally, a personal story. We're normally reporting what's happened in elsewhere in the news, but you have become, well, you haven't become the story itself, but you've managed to enjoy a bit of news by meeting a bit of news.
I did. I inserted myself into a story, Emma. We're taught not to do this, aren't we, when we're trained as journalists? But what the heck? And we were speaking, you and I, on the Sunday programme a week or so ago about Tadej Pogačar, the greatest male cyclist in the world, the greatest one of my lifetime, who's just won the Tour de France for the 4th time. And he's Slovenian, and he just turned up in his hometown at the weekend, which is, it's not even a hometown, it's a home village. 1,000 people live there. And it's bike rideable from Ljubljana. I got there in just under an hour. And he was hosting a nice little event for the afternoon and evening of bike races. He sponsors a children's cycling club, which is called Poggi Team. And as I got into this little place called Komenda, there's a sign for bicycle parking. And who should help me in parking my bicycle but Tadej Pogačar's mum? Who was lovely. And I'm just thinking, how many sports superstars? I mean, this guy is a genuinely massive deal in his sport. Multi-millionaire, ultra champion, and here's his little cycling festival in his little village, and his mum is parking the bikes. And she was very lovely, and we had a chat with her, and I had a chat with Tadej as well, and some of his superstar cycling mates who turned up. And of course, everybody's just terrified that not only have you got this Campionissimo from Slovenia winning everything at the moment in the sport, but there he is sponsoring the next generation of Slovene riders who are going to crush everybody.
Guy Delorney, Monocle's Balkans correspondent, on the line from the cellar in Ljubljana. Thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. Now it's Friday, so that means it's time for What We Learned. Here's Andrew Muller.
We learned this week that this will put you to sleep. No, not Monocle Radio's widely beloved Friday news review, What We Learned, very amusing, but this, i.e. a conch shell being blown into. All right, put it down. Knew this would happen. We learned from boffins at the Eternal Heart Care Centre and Research Institute in Jaipur that the conch for God's sake, may secrete a cure for sleep apnea. Not the sound of the conch as such, but the breathing techniques necessary to get a sound out of it. So we learned that while these are exciting times for sufferers of sleep apnea, they may be less so for their neighbours. But sticking with the subject of neighbours being vexed by unsolicited din, and once again, do you see how seamlessly these things are stitched together? We learned of a thaw across the Korean border. Well, possibly. Sure, but maybe don't get too carried away. We learned that there would be, for the moment at least, no more of this. That being the loudspeaker broadcasts with which South Korea taunts its northern neighbour with reminders of the bountiful blessings of capitalism, including K-pop. Which you would reckon would actually be sufficient to inculcate renewed passion for the revolutionary thought of Comrade Kim Jong-un and or nosebleeds. However, we learned that South Korea had reportedly decided to allow North Korean sentries to take their earplugs out. And we also learned that North Korea had accordingly reciprocated, meaning that South Koreans would be subjected to less of this. From which we apparently learned that the North Korean army is whiling away the long evenings in the DMZ by establishing a didgeridoo orchestra. But we learned that maybe not. For we learned that North Korea, in the person of Kim Yo-jong, sister of cake-appreciating Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un, was not having it.
Kim Yo-jong, the powerful sister of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, has rejected Seoul's conciliatory measures and reaffirmed Pyongyang's intent to maintain its hostile stance.
We learned further that North Korea has, quote, no will to further cross-border outreach, and that reports that North Korea had unplugged its speakers were, quote, an unfounded unilateral supposition and a red herring, i.e. both the worst kind of supposition and the worst kind of herring. But we also learn from scanning the North Korean papers, as we so very often do, that it's not all bad, and that the new coastal resort of Myeongsasimni is becoming, quote, famous for daily growing people's laughter under the loving care of the motherly party. Big hello to all our listeners in Myeongsasimni.
Hello!
But sticking with the subject of compromises ultimately unlikely to please anybody, we learned how incredibly irritating it is when important news events are scheduled for Fridays, when we have to have this thing written and recorded by Thursday afternoon latest. For we learned that such satirical amusement as we might wish to wring from this week's Molotov-Ribbentrop tribute act in Anchorage would have to be wrung from the preliminaries, which, happily, did not disappoint.
You know, I'm going to see Putin. I'm going to Russia on Friday.
We learned that US President Donald Trump appeared not to have learned that Russia had in fact sold Alaska to the United States back in 1867 for the miserable sum of $7.2 million, still only about $156 million in today's money. Or perhaps that Trump had already resolved to sell it back for $157 million and claim a profit. A big hello to all our listeners in what may be, as of this broadcast, Alaska Oblast.
Hello!
We learned that in the meantime, Trump's administration intended to deploy a peacekeeping force to Washington, D.C.
Let me be crystal clear. Crime in D.C. is ending and ending today.
Which was arguably bold chat from Attorney General Pam Bondi, given that a 34 times convicted criminal was standing right behind her. But we learned that nobody was more determined to come down hard on scofflaws beleaguering the nation's capital than the felon in question, or indeed in chief.
If you so much as touch or even think about destroying a statue or a monument in Washington, D.C., you go to jail for 10 years with no probation, no anything.
From which we learned that he's thinking on the unforgivableness of any wanton destruction and desecration of DC's public spaces has evolved somewhat since about 10 minutes ago.
On the evening of his inauguration, President Donald Trump not wasting any time getting down to business. He has just returned to the White House and is signing a series of executive actions in the Oval Office. where he is pardoning some 1,500 January 6 rioters.
But we learned that there was at least one criminal that this administration, specifically its Department of Justice and State Department, was not prepared to indulge. We learned this also from Attorney General Pam Bondi, who every day has to reckon with the fact that she was second choice after Matt Gaetz, who was once found by congressional ethics investigators to have paid a 17-year-old for sex, which must be quite the rolling existential crisis. Can I get some general muttered agreement? And we learn from Bondi's solemn utterances of a potential source of the kind of seed capital we need to make these weekly monologues even better, like with our own orchestra or whatever.
Today, the Department of Justice and State Department are announcing a historic $50 million reward for information leading to the arrest of Nicolas Maduro.
He's in the Miraflores Palace on Urdaneta Avenue in Caracas, near the junction with Avenida Sucre. Seriously, you can't miss it. It's the pink building with mauve pillars and a big Venezuelan flag out the front. You can send us the check, care of the office. Address is on the website. For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Muller.
And my thanks to Andrew and all the team on What We Learned. You're listening to Monocle Radio.
With UBS, you have a truly global partner, incorporating new technologies, innovative approaches, and unexpected opportunities, leading you to insights that help answer the questions that matter, delivered with passion, care, and unmatched expertise. Because it's about rising with the dawn each day, knowing that we can do even better. That's what banking is to us. Not just work, but a craft. UBS. Banking is our craft.
Now, in the heart of Atlanta, the strip club Magic City hosted guests like Quincy Jones and Janet Jackson and shaped American hip-hop and fashion culture for 40 years. Well, a documentary series has been made about it called Magic City, an American Fantasy, and it pulls back the curtain on an overlooked American cultural institution. The programmes were executive produced by the Canadian rapper Drake, and its series executive producer was Cole Brown. And he spoke a little earlier to Anita Riotta, who began by asking Cole to describe just how much of an impact Magic City had.
Magic City has been around for 40 years now. It was started in 1985 by a guy who is now legendarily known as Mr. Magic. His real name is Michael Barney. And in the 40 years since its establishment, it has really become kind of the go-to cultural place for shaping Southern hip-hop culture nationally. So many of the hits that we now identify with the city of Atlanta, which has become kind of the mecca of hip-hop, were born in that club. But then also the women of Magic City have become kind of icons in their own right and have shaped national fashion choices. And pole dancing is now something that people do to work out in Williamsburg. And that is not a thing that existed before a lot of these Magic City women brought it to prominence. So it's this little club that is still the same footprint that it was in 1985, but it has had sort of immense outsized impact over the 40 years since it began.
And why did you want to tell this story?
I was in Atlanta working with this legendary music producer named Jermaine Dupri, who did a lot of Usher and Mariah Carey's music. I remember we were working on a book and he was telling me his stories of basically creating the sound of Atlanta. And he would tell me these stories of going to this little club that I had heard of before called Magic City with Janet Jackson and Quincy Jones, but also really big-time drug dealers, state senators, and just this cross-section of humanity that seemed unlikely to congregate anywhere, let alone a strip club. So I was like, there's got to be something really interesting happening in this place. And then once I got to know the story better, it was really the classic American story in the sense that you have this founder who came from nothing, built this business, is now handing it down to his sons, and in the 40 years that elapsed in between has gone through all manner of chaos. I mean, he went to prison for 9 years. Rival club owners burned the club down. It was just this crazy blood and treasure story that I feel like we're familiar with in America, similar to a Rockefeller or a Kennedy or a Carnegie. And that was really exciting to me as well.
You have it in the series title that this is an American fantasy. Can you sort of expound on that? What American fantasy do you think Magic City represents?
Those two words were both kind of guiding forces as we were shaping the show. And I should mention Charles Todd, who's the director on the show, who I worked closely with at every step of the way. He was crucial to this as well. The American part, I really want to disaggregate away from this being a quote unquote Black story, not in the sense that it's not. Of course it is. And this is a Black founder and an incredible story of Black entrepreneurship. But so many of the core tenets that I identified in this story as being really exciting are just like core American tenets. Again, that story of the Carnegies and the Rockefellers. It's the Joe Kennedy story before John F. Kennedy comes about. These people are hustlers in the truest and best sense of the word.
In the series, both behind the camera as producers and in front of the camera as interview subjects, you have a slew of very recognizable faces and names. What do you think this adds to the story, and how is that an example of just really the impact that Magic City's had?
When we came to this story, there were three core principles that we were trying to get across. One is this story of the great American founder story that is Michael Barney and Mr. Magic, and I've already talked a bit about that. Two, obviously, is the stories of the women, and that is its own story of entrepreneurship and all sorts of interesting questions around agency and independence and power and that, right? But then three is this story of hip hop. When Magic City starts in 1985, there is no Southern hip hop culture to speak of, really. Today in 2025, Atlanta is the epicenter of hip hop internationally. And that happens as a direct result of this club. So we really wanted to go to the people who made that so. So in the story, you see Big Boy talk about him and Andre 3000, who come together to form Outkast, testing some of their biggest records in the club. You see, of course, Drake, who's an executive producer on the project, talking about testing his records with Future and so many others in the club. Whoop, There It Is, which is an iconic song, was actually created by a Magic City DJ, and the original lyrics were Whoop, Magic City. So what you see is like, for 40 years, Magic City becomes almost like a Forrest Gump, appearing at every critical intersection point of Southern hip hop. And that was really exciting. And we wanted to make sure that we got all of those folks. And there's a ton of fun ones. T.I., 2 Chainz, the list goes on.
So you mentioned, of course, at the heart of this story are the women, the dancers. What's one of the most memorable things you learned from the dancers?
Man, there's so many. Sometimes people ask, like, what do you want folks to take away from this series? And with nowhere more so than with the dancers, I want people to appreciate how much they subvert expectations. I think that people come to a quote unquote Magic City sort of strip club documentary with all sorts of preconceptions and stereotypes about what that place is, who the business owner is, and of course, who the dancers are, who these people on stage must be. And I now know these women really well. I mean, this project took years to complete, and I've spent a lot of time with dancers from the early 80s all the way to, dancing today. These women are just some of the strongest, most independent, sort of inhabiting their agency women I've ever met in my life. And so many of them are so proud of the work that they do and incredibly excited to be performers, are athletes and mothers and entertainers in their own right. So I really just think that their stories will challenge what people think they understand about who these people are that choose to do this work.
That was Cole Brown, the creator and executive producer for Magic City, an American Fantasy. He was talking to Monocle's Anita Riotta, and Magic City premieres in the US today on Stars. You're with The Globalist. Now, the summer box office is always a fairly accurate bellwether when it comes to who's doing well in cinema. Well, this year, Warner Brothers are doing very well indeed, with 6 films taking more than $40 million each back-to-back when they opened. What's their secret? Well, to explain, I'm joined in the studio by film critic Karen Krasanovic. A very good morning to you, Karen. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. A beautiful Friday, and I'm trying to get everybody to go to the movies. In fact, when I walk through my building, I live in a terrible block. Why did I buy that place? I always meet my neighbors and they'll say, I haven't seen Superman yet, and I haven't seen Weapons yet, and I haven't, because I'm always saying, go see Weapons, go see Sinners, go see Final Destination, go see. It's really important, and I think people of all generations are starting to understand post-pandemic, and it's been 5 years now, which impacted a lot of industries, but particularly the cinematic industry, the exhibition industry side. People are starting to go back and understand the use of the big screen. And we've got a great reason to go back now. In fact, Warner Brothers has given us at least 6 reasons to go back.
I was trying to work out what they've actually done that's different, because we sort of write and rewrite it. Said Warner Brothers doing very well, 6 films taking more than $40 million each back to back when they open. Just explain what that is all about.
Well, okay, don't forget Warner Brothers, big studio and considered one of the wealthiest. I mean, when you're working for Warner Brothers, you think, I'm going to have nice catering. It's great. So 2024 was a bad year for them, but they basically tried to do the same thing as they did this year. They did Joker Folie à Deux, which was a terrible flop, and everybody makes fun of it. But it was bold. It was a bold choice. And that was a sequel of a very quirky film that accidentally did very well. And then we had Bong Joon-ho's Mickey 17. He did Parasite, huge award winner and crowd pleaser. That was also awful. And then The Alto Nights with De Niro playing himself twice because we haven't had enough of him. And that was... I couldn't watch the rest of it, but I tried my best. So, look, Warner Brothers going, wow, we've tried this. Let's try another thing. So they had Superman in the works for a while, but they've also, Superman, okay, great IP. Everybody knows Superman. Redo it for today. So, and they hit with that. And they've decided that they're going to, it's a balance. Okay, I'm cut too long, didn't read. It's a balance between sequels and new things that we might like, done by people who are daring.
So just talk us through the sequels and talk us through the new things that people might like, which are daring. Because given what you've just said about Joker Folie à Deux, etc., actually being daring doesn't necessarily either pay off or indeed work.
It really doesn't. I mean, I've got an MBA in film finance, and I know how difficult it is to try and get a film funded. In fact, we had a chap come in to talk to us saying, I'm going to invest in your slate of films, but I want them all to be winners. It's like, so
of course we do.
You can't do that.
And
all
you ride horses, right?
I do.
And it's the same thing. Can you breed a champion every time you have a little pony?
It's a very good analogy. No, you cannot. So Warner Brothers had a look, and okay, they're looking at the pedigree, as you would a horse, if we're going to use that analogy. Okay, I don't even know where to start, but Minecraft, people love Minecraft, huge hit. And that was that had $150 million budget. And so far, I think it's made $162, but it's still going. So if you're going to look at how successful a film is, you find out what the reported budget is. Reported because it's none of our business what it really is, and then double that, because that will be the budget again is the marketing cost. So then that's why you look at things. Anyway, so what they decided was they had a mix of very successful franchises. Let's say Final Destination. I know it's creepy, but I watched it. They had Superman, again, a reboot. We were all curious. And then we had Minecraft. My kids will love it. I forgot to have kids. But then they decide, well, let's try and take a star in Cars. So we've got F1. Now, F1 had some problems filming, and the budget ballooned. It's doing quite well. But then Ryan Coogler, who is, a brilliant filmmaker, they give him a chance with basically, it's a vampire story set down south and in the deep American South of the 1920s called Sinners. Huge, $90 million budget, but it's done incredibly well. So,
what did they do next?
Am I answering any of the questions?
It's fine. We're all just having a lovely listen.
Oh, sorry.
So what happens next then? Because obviously they've hit the jackpot this year.
They have.
What 2026? The planning department must be having must be scratching its.
Well, they're still figuring 2026 out, because that's going to be moving around a little bit. But we still have the rest of this year. We've got 2025, and I've got some predictions for you. Okay, there's 2 franchises coming up for the rest of this year. That's The Conjuring: Last Rites, which is spooky horror franchise, and then Mortal Kombat 2. You know what that is. And I think those 2 are going to do moderately well. But the real bet here is Paul Thomas Anderson's One Battle After Another. It has Leonardo DiCaprio in it. And that should have been at Venice, but it is not. So that's a question right there. But I think what they've done is they're mixing original and tried and true good franchises. That's the secret.
Karen Krasanovic, thank you as ever for joining me in the studio. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to the producers, Chris Chermak and Anita Riotta. Our researcher was Henry King. Our studio manager was Elliot Greenfield, with editing assistance by Mariella Bevan. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing's live at midday here in London. The Globalist is back at the same time on Monday. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening. Have a great weekend.